Oh, there we go. There we go. Okay, so do
Hit that,
that. Yeah,
and then share.
right.
And then if you go onto your Safari, you can do present.
Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen now. Okay, so Kate and I are going to talk.
I don't. There we go.
Okay. So just very quickly, I won't spend a long time doing this, but I did the certification in 2007 in Mallorca, and then next year with my MED. These are the places where I have taught historically for 23 years. I've been an international educator, and I've done most of my work with the IB. And currently, Kate and I are at Branksome Hall, Asia on Jeju Island.
And I did not do any coursework at TCNJ. I came along as a trailing spouse to enjoy Mallorca and support Russ while he's working. I hear the giggles in the background. You know how easy it is to enjoy Mallorca in the summertime. I'm currently working on an EDD through Johns Hopkins University that's entirely online while I'm teaching full-time here in Branksome Hall, Asia. And so I've agreed to support Russ in his presentation by sharing a few of the things that I've been working on through that research.
So one of the things Kate's been focusing on is culture and EAL, English language acquisition, particularly at an academic level. So it kind of fits in quite well with some of the things we were going to look at today. And so as we talk, if you give you a sense of maybe how you might potentially reflect on your own classroom, or so we asked, these few questions, are you in a diverse classroom or a monocultural classroom, right? How those cultures affect the perception of education for your students, to a lesser extent, your parents, depending on where you're at. And then how do these cultures influence the intersection of students and teachers? And that's where we're going to focus on today, is how we can get to that bridge there. And then, in what ways does cultures actually help us achieve our educational goals? And then, of course, what kind of disconnects are there? And so I think I'm going to, I'm sorry, before I turn it over to Kate. So Jeju Branksome Hall is on a pre-K through 12 all-girls school. Well, actually take that back. It's a boys' school and a junior school. But Kate and I work in the middle and senior school. It's about 90% Korean national. So it's a predominantly a monocultural school, but we do the IB diploma and middle years program. Though we're going to focus mostly on the last 2 years of high school.
So here's some slides that I prepared when I was working with some of the teachers at Branksome Hall, Asia. I was trying to really point out the way that our culture as North Americans might differ in its perception of paths to success compared to our Korean students and their families. And I pulled this image because I think a lot of folks play this game when they're a child, and Chutes and Ladders is a really good representation, I think, of how Americans perceive our path to success. We can roll the dice and we might get on block 9 there, where you're lucky to get a ladder, and you might pop up to block 31. And it's representing that you can take a lot of different paths to success in the North American view. You might not decide to go to a 4-year university right away. You might go to community college for 2 years and then transfer to a 4-year university. However, in what I've understood about Korean cultures, there's a really narrow and sort of rigid path to success, and that it requires that beginning in grade 8, when you're initially can be tracked in your schooling, that you achieve at a certain level, and that you have to get into a certain one of 2 or 3 universities, and that will really determine your future career success. And I don't think that many of our colleagues, especially those of us from a North American system, had appreciated the difference between those two views of paths of the way education leads to success. So it was an example of how culture was not creating harmony in the way that our teachers and our students viewed education as a path to success.
And so here, and of course, we're just giving you this background so to give you some context about how our ideas of using a process-oriented classroom can bridge some of these difficulties. And these are some of the difficulties that we face here, is that students and parents are very much grade-oriented. And it's about achieving the grade. It's not about learning. It's really not about the process. It's also quite a competitive culture. Collaboration is not a strong part of our culture at school. In fact, I've often given essays back with comments and grades, and students will literally kind of rush to a corner so they can back up into the corner and then sneak a peek at the comments and the grades so no one can look over their shoulders. And as you can imagine, it has quite an impact on some of the activities we do in class. Also, the learning is fairly passive. We as teachers are supposed to be the fount of all knowledge and give direction. In fact, last year I had a senior, probably about this time last year, and I was going through some things, and she goes, "Well, why don't you just teach us?" And of course, I stopped and I said, "Well, I don't think that's my job. My job is to make you think." And so, these are some of the issues we have to deal with. Another major issue is that for many of our students, excellence only means perfection, which can lead to all kinds of social and emotional issues. We've seen students become literally paralyzed because they don't know how to be perfect. And so they just freeze up and everything stops. And I think if we look at a process orientation, it's a little bit easier to overcome some of those barriers, because in the process, it's easier to perfect the next step of a process instead of just perfecting the end result. And the last one, for some of our students, I'm not sure, maybe Kay has a better sense, I'm not sure what percentage, but many of them see our language as acquisition as instrumental. It's purely there to function their needs, and they don't really engage in any kind of English outside of the academic classroom. Others, however, are planning, most of them are actually planning to go to university overseas. So this is what happens. So in some ways, we have this disconnect between the two cultures, and yet we have to meet in the classroom. And so one of the issues that we often see here is everyone wants a 7. So if you're familiar with the IB, it's the highest grade you can get is a 7. And so you have to start thinking about, well, what do my students understand a 7 to be? Content, skills, communicate, etc., right? But you can see I have a question mark there because I really don't know, and I don't think our students actually know. And so what it usually comes down to, there's some kind of abstract perception of what 7 quality work is, or they really don't have a clue. They just know it's a number and they can't explain it. And so it makes it kind of difficult to happen. And so we see this in terms of English in some of these issues here. Do you want to talk about this?
One of the things that Russ mentioned was the integral versus instrumental orientation to second language. And many students see their English as only an academic language. And it's, an acknowledged fact in second language acquisition that mother tongue maintenance is really important. We have to support our students in continuing to develop their mother tongue. Often that's Korean. But that also kind of has tension with the idea that taking a step to like fluency in a second language can be very difficult. A common framework for language acquisition is the fourth phase is almost always a sort of plateau phase. And once you get to that fifth phase of fluency, that was tricky. Anyways, it can be a really long time and a lot of effort. So when we talk about English language acquisition in the academic classroom, we have to think very carefully about how we approach English and how our students approach English. We can't assume that they're going to take on English as an identity. So it's important that we teach the structure of language in a very explicit way, and that we practice it in the context of the academic use that the children are using it. One of the really useful things that we can impart to our students is some meta-linguistic knowledge. So that means knowledge about language. And I'm a big fan of teaching this particular example of meta-linguistic knowledge. A nominalization is a grammatics term that describes a construction of language that's very common in science. And seed dispersal is the example of nominalization that I always use. And it's tricky for students because seed dispersal is somewhat passive. You can't find what is doing the dispersal. It's plants themselves. It's an abstract and less concrete way of thinking, but it's really necessary by the time students get to that academic writing that's very dense at especially the older grades.
So this is just another example. You can actually see how much information is actually compacted into that little bold part, the transportation of convicts to New South Wales. This is something I've really just started playing with myself. So I'm still kind of getting used to doing this, but it does seem to have some advantages. This one, however, is really important, and I do teach this fairly frequently, not very frequently, but certainly early each year and touch on it periodically throughout. We just, for those of us, especially who are native or mother tongue English speakers, we just take these things for granted, and yet you can really see eyes opening up when they see that the it of one sentence actually is referring back to the previous sentence, and it really is quite powerful. And so I guess here we're talking about the process of how to use language. It becomes really important. And so what I focus on in terms of language, and I really didn't expect I'd ever be teaching so much grammar, but that has become the case. And so I really kind of do just a little bit, a lot of the basics, primarily for reading. And what I'm really finding is I have to look at the prefixes and suffixes, because that becomes really confusing. And I always ask them, can you identify the root? And we talk about how either the prefix or suffix changes that, so they actually understand the context of what's going on. But really what I focus on mostly in terms of English is writing. And I'll come back to that when I look at how I kind of help teach writing in a few minutes. So this is how, I guess we're focusing on the process of English so that they can understand the content that we have to deal with as DP teachers. One of the things I've done in my classroom is I really don't give homework anymore. We do almost all the reading in class. And so I've created this way to give them feedback as they read, and also a sense of how they should understand what they're reading. I know there's a lot of words here. I'll give you an example. There's an example on the next slide. And so I will break them up sometimes into small groups. Small groups can work here, really small groups, and you have to kind of base it on the table grouping because they're comfortable with the people at their table. So that's one of the ways this idea of competition impacts us. But you create this sense of a structure, but with it open enough that's going to require them to actually do the thinking. And by not letting them do this at home, I can be there as they are first encountering the information, and I can clarify things if they become confused. And I kind of literally will walk around from group to group, or on a Google Doc, I will see how this happens. And this actually began, about 12 years ago when I was teaching in Thailand, which was even about 95%. And we had just started the DP program, and I gave a reading assignment, and I gave each student a section to read. And the next day she's reporting back on it, and I have no idea what she's talking about. I literally took her reading assignment and I'm reading it as she's talking, and then I figured out what happened. She was having a difficulty anytime there were clauses added to a sentence, and she would lose the subject and get things confused. And so starting about 12, 13 years ago, I really kind of started pulling away more and more from reading, to now, really, I don't really give them reading homework unless we're way behind and content wise. But what I found, it does a couple things. It helps promote metacognition. They begin to understand not just the information that they have, but how it applies to our learning objectives. And so they can come to actually understand what to do. And along the way, I work on them becoming more concise, because what I do is I will set up a Google Doc. And in this case, we were looking at the Russian Civil War, Russian Revolution, and Russian Civil War. And so I will break up a group, and some groups will be looking at the Bolsheviks. And these are the things I want them to think about. What actions did they take? What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses? And then I'll give them a reading assignment. And here is a point where I'm actually working online. You can see some of the questions I'm able to give as I'm watching them record their notes. I really try not to allow them to have big blocks like this. So I probably at some point was going to make them come down and become very much bullet points. So they work on concision, and also to get them to summarize. And so what I found, I started doing this quite in Tunisia. And then what I found is by the end of the year, sometime in grade 12, the senior year, sometime between January and March, there was probably going to be 3 or 4 days when I walked into the classroom and I'm watching the Google Doc, I'm listening to the students talk. I have nothing to do. They have figured it out. Means I have to be willing to go really slow, though, in grade 11. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the DP program, it's a two-year course. So you have to go slow at first, but it became so powerful. And like I said, there were days when I didn't know what to say. I didn't know what to do. Everything was covered. They weren't even missing things. And so this is a way, as they learn knowledge, not just to learn it, but how do I work with it? So this is an example. By the way, I will share this PowerPoint in the chat, and I have links to all the documents here that I'm giving if you're interested. So that's one way I'm using process pretty much every day. Almost every day we do this. Occasionally it gets a little boring, so occasionally we have to do something that's kind of exciting or make them work on something a bigger deal. But I would say 3/4 of my class periods are probably spent this way in the DP program. And so because of the culture, like I mentioned earlier, I usually don't use this chart as a whole class. So in Stuttgart and in Tunisia, I could put the whole class on there and everyone would see what everyone else is doing. And it became, kind of a nice little massive jigsaw. But here, I can't do that very often. We'll do one as a whole group and I'll kind of like be the leader. But it can work in small groups or for individuals. And so I can still use this here, but I have to be careful because it's not just competition in the sense I don't want people to know what I don't know, but I don't want to give my potential competitor information they may not know. And so this is a modification I've had to do here at BHA, whereas in my previous schools, I never had to do that. Another thing we work on really, really a lot here in history is if you do the DP exam, it's all essay writing. It's probably the most writing intense of all the subjects. And so this school and in my previous schools, we use a protocol called PEEL, and maybe you're familiar with it. If not, this is how we structure our paragraphs. And so you can see here, the point becomes the topic sentence, the assertion that's going to be developed in the paragraph. And they need to provide evidence that supports this topic sentence and explains it. Or I'm sorry, not explains it, but then they must do explicit explaining of the evidence. So linking the evidence to the topic sentence. And then finally, the last piece is they have to either wrap up the paragraph nicely or link to the next one. And so what's really nice is when we're talking in class, because they know we're going to be using PEEL, if someone says something to me, if I ask a question and they give me an assertion, I can go, well, prove it. What do you mean? Give me your evidence for that. Okay. Oh, no. So how does that evidence actually support your assertion? And so we can actually do this in the classroom as we speak. And so it's become quite effective. And we actually do this in the lower grades here at BHA, and it's starting to become quite effective here. So you can see this PEEL actually when the students are sitting and thinking either in class as we're discussing something or as they're preparing an essay, it promotes the idea of structure, how to actually organize your critical thinking. It brings coherence. It has to be relevant. This is another problem we have. So everything has to fit with the topic sentence. And I'm going to kind of speed up a little bit here because I've only got about 2 minutes and I got a couple more things I would like to talk about. In terms of writing an essay, is I will create some kind of a form. A lot of students like a table. So you can see here the process is there. And then students can give me their thought process as they're working on an essay, and I can look at this, and then we can talk about what's working well, where any kind of disconnects could be, and then I can get them to work on that. And again, sometimes this is done verbally, but also what I do is focus on writing. And so one part of grammar that I do is for topic sentences, I really require them to use the active voice. And here's an example that was just maybe about 3-4 weeks ago. We were talking about the use of force in Nazi for authoritarian leaders. And so a student wrote, a type of force used by Hitler was the legal system, which is perfectly good example to use. But the problem is the student quit focusing on the legal system and started looking at other types of force. And so I really do this, the only time I require them, because we do have various levels of English language. So, but I do require them to use active voice. And so it allows them to keep focus, and we can keep going back. Well, what's the subject of the topic sentence? What's the subject of the topic sentence? And that really helps a lot. The last thing I would like to talk about is the feedback. I provide feedback that allows students to identify what needs to be improved. And then the last thing I do is I allow them to rewrite it and to allow them to try to improve their grade. And I don't use a rubric because what I find is that a rubric describes the finished work. And if the student doesn't know what a 7 is, the rubric really doesn't help them understand the 7. And we can see here in IB, the language itself can be quite ambiguous. And so I create a checklist. And the student, I'll grade it, have comments, and the student then goes through, uses this checklist to identify areas that need to be improved. And then we talk about it, and then they have a chance to improve. And that's how I use writing and feedback as a process. And I think I finished just at 10 o'clock. So, but if you don't have another session, I'm happy to talk about any kind of questions you might have. And let me post this link to this PowerPoint so you can refer to everything in it as well. Does anybody have any questions or comments?
Yes. Hello. Thank you so much for your presentation. It's actually very therapeutic, to be honest. I've been teaching abroad for years now, and so when I hear, actually, I'm based in Izmir, Turkey. I'm a teacher at the American Collegiate Institute of Izmir, and a lot of what you are sharing mirrors exactly what I'm experiencing. I wanted a little more info about not using a rubric.
Hmm.
So is maybe a little more clarity on that. Like, what exactly does that mean? Because we have a rubric for IB.
Yeah.
Um, am I misunderstanding? Like, are you're not using a rubric in terms of numbers, like grading? Yeah,
Yeah.
if I could just
Understand. Of course, I do use a rubric, but I don't use a rubric as a tool for them to make improvements on their writing, because they can see in that rubric, while I'm in like maybe the 7-9 section, but it doesn't really tell them how to get to the next column over. And so yes, they get the rubric so they know where they're at, but that at is the end product. It doesn't really help them figure out what they have to do in order to change to improve their grade. And so that's why I went back to that checklist. And the check, maybe I should bring it back up really quickly here.
Can I say
Yeah,
something about
yeah,
checklists? You
yeah.
can go ahead and bring it up. I mean, one of the things that Russ is getting at here is that because the rubrics are written in teacher language, the students need an interpretation. And I think what a checklist does, and I use them in my science classes as well, I think what a checklist does is put some of the rubric information into student-friendly language, but also the checklist can unpack the sort of hidden things in the rubric that the students aren't aware are implied. And that's one of the reasons why, like Russ, I don't use rubric till the end. I use checklists that are built off of the rubric at the beginning, and then the grade still comes on the rubric because that is the contract that we have with them about the way their grades get determined.
Yeah. So you can see the rubric is actually organized into 2 sections. How do you organize, literally how you organize your writing, and then the second part is literally how you structure your argument. And you can go through here. Are you using only one theme? Are you doing a thematic approach? Are you using the appeal structure? And then down here we can look at presenting evidence. And then over the years, these are some of the common issues students have. They're using information that's not relevant. It's not accurate. They're not using the terms, right? Or they think they've explained, but it's really implicit explanation, but they need to do something to actually make it clear. And so by looking at the process of structuring it, it also helps their thinking as well. And very often by the end of the first year, they're not doing rewrites anymore. And the rewrite, I allow them to rewrite because I also found previous schools that students want to improve, but they're afraid to take a risk of doing something different. And so if I allow them to do a rewrite and the best grade, the original of the rewrite goes into the grade book, then they're more willing to take that risk. Now in grade 12, since we have to prepare for the DP exam, they don't do rewrites. Right, everything is like we start approving. So this is grade 11, really the first year, and it's been really helpful.
thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. Is there anything else?
Just a comment. Thanks very much. This was really insightful.
Well, thank you so much. I really started thinking about this, like I said, back in Bangkok in probably 2008, 2009, something like that. When it was a somewhat similar culture to what we have here in Korea. And then Tunisia was very dynamic, and so at Stuttgart we had many different, multinational corporate cultures as well. But the process still worked. And so, I really found that I was really shocked when that student just didn't understand anything. And then I realized there's an assumption sometimes we give homework that the students will actually understand it. And if they have a few questions, we'll clarify it. But the problem is they learn it wrong. And especially if there's a couple of days between meetings, once I meet them, I have to unteach it, right? And so that they can learn it again. And so I really kind of have really minimized the amount of homework I do. And I still somehow get through the DP curriculum. So, but thank you so much. I hope it's at least gives you some ideas to work off and think about.
Absolutely. It's these subtle nuances that we need some way to be prepared for. My entree to thinking this way was a colleague who told me about students from a country with an oppressive regime, where she was having them share their thoughts in development and couldn't do it. And finally, a colleague said, they've learned over the years, you don't share your thoughts.
Mm.
So it's a very unnatural practice for them. But, these are things.
Yeah, and it's very important that we kind of have to learn, especially when we go into these cultures that are unfamiliar with us, right? And you really have to pick up the nuances, like you said. Sometimes it's little clues, or even clues like everything I tried doesn't work, so it's got to be something else, right?
Yeah.
But well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Well, it was a pleasure. I hope you got the link to the doc. It should work. It should be available to anybody with the link. If not, you can always email me, and I'm happy to if you want to talk a little bit further via email, we can start there and then move on from there.
Thank you.
You're very welcome. Welcome. Thank you for spending time with us.
Thank you so much.
All right.
I really appreciate it.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of the Ed Fest.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.